Hi, everyone. Welcome back after the break. I hope you had a good time and I hope you enjoyed the weather today. It was awesome. I was out there with my shorts on today. So that may be it. That's probably the last time we'll be doing that for the winter. I want to talk a bit about Mad Men today in light of the episode that you'll be watching for this week. And, um, and then later we're going to talk about the idea of subliminal advertising. So first, starting with Mad Men, I'm a big fan of the show. I remember when the show came first started coming out 7 or 8 years ago or whatever it was, and I was teaching advertising related material, and some of it was heavily historical, like what we do in this course. And so it was my kind of heyday moment, right? That there was this incredibly popular show about the history of advertising, and I was doing similar things with my own research in that. I think the show is fascinating on a number of levels. I'm just going to briefly mention some of this. I'm not going to go into in depth detail about Mad Men. But let me just say it's the early seasons of Mad Men that. So the show actually moves through historical time. It starts in 1960 and it ends in about 1970. And it effectively, a season of Mad Men is about a year or so of actual time, right? So those early seasons, first three or so, that would deal with this period from 1960 to 64, is a fascinating time because it's a kind of transitional or in between or what's described as liminal time. It's not quite, it's no longer the 1950s in terms of what we think about in terms of the cultural aspects of that decade. But it's not really the 1960s yet, right? I mean, there's no real youth counterculture yet. There's not the sense of social unrest that will come to define the later 1960s. So it's in this in between time, the way that you're working through some of the very significant cultural changes that would happen from the 50s into the 60s, that you see this ad agency, which itself is trying to work through some of these changes. Uh, the show is interesting from the aspect of just historical foresight. So it includes many actual historical events in the plot lines of the show, right? So when there's an episode that deals with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in 1962, and we, the viewers, know how that story ends. We know that there was not nuclear war that resulted from that, but of course the characters don't know that. And in some ways, it's fascinating. It's an interesting place to be as a viewer because you kind of know how it's going to end. The characters don't, and you actually get to see them working through the implications of something like that. So that aspect is really interesting. I mean, there's other things too about the historical specificity of the show. There's a scene in the first season of Mad Men where Don Draper, who's the main character, I'll get to him later, where he's actually looking at he's reading a newspaper, and there's a big ad, the ad that we looked at last time for VW, Volkswagen, right? It's the lemon ad, I believe. And he's looking at this ad and he's trying to figure out, this is at the start of the campaign, and he's trying to figure out, what's it about. And he says this line, "I don't know what I hate about it the most." And in fact, the effect of that ad campaign, the effect of the creative revolution, will later start to transform their ad agency as well, Draper's ad agency, right? So the show is fascinating also for the kind of historical detailing. It tends to try to portray things as accurately as it can. So, for example, if Don Draper is getting on the train to go home to his suburb north of New York City, if he's catching the 6:40 train, it's because at that time there was a 6:40 train that left for those suburbs. If they're depicting the day after the Cuban Missile Crisis ends, or the day after, say, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and it's a rainy day, then the characters in the show come to work that day wearing raincoats and that sort of thing. The show is it has this historical detail, but it's not just the sort of fun or the kind of positive aspects of history, right? There's a lot of negative things that are depicted, right, that were factors in that historical time period. So it's not some kind of rosy-eyed view. It's more of a clear-eyed view, right? You do see things like anti-Semitic jokes. You see pregnant women smoking, quite a lot actually. You see misogyny, sexism. There's a great scene where Don Draper's family go for a picnic with his wife and kids, and they're on the grass. And after the picnic, they've got all this garbage from their picnic. And what do they do with it? They just sort of throw it right onto the grass and get in their car and leave. Right? This idea about an approach to littering that today just seems so alien. There's the other factor with the sort of surface pleasures of the show, in the sense that the aesthetic of the show is wonderful. I mean, the attention to detail, the attention to the clothes that characters wear, the kind of whiskey glasses they drink from, the scenes in which the sets in which are used for the show, the kind of bad behavior that's part and parcel of the show. Lots of whiskey drinking at work, office sex, hotel office sex, lots of sex actually. And so there's that kind of the allure of the sort of surface pleasures of the show. But I think primarily the show is about the deeper mysteries of identity, right? And the depth of that as well. So the main character is Don Draper. You see him depicted here. He's a very kind of cool, kind of commanding character who is the creative director of Sterling Cooper, the ad agency. He's got a kind of old-fashioned sense of masculinity. One could argue more like a William Holden type of masculinity. But his character is fundamentally flawed. He's actually literally in a flight from his own past. He was, as a youngster, he was orphaned. He was raised by different family members. At one point, he lived in a brothel because that's who the relative was who was looking after him. That's where she was. And he had this sort of very troubled upbringing. In his early 20s, he goes off to war, to the Korean War. And he effectively reinvents himself there. And how does he do that? Well, Don Draper was not Don Draper when he was born. He was Dick Whitman. And Dick Whitman goes to war. And there's a fire. And in that fire, a fellow named Don Draper, a fellow soldier, is burned. He dies. And what Dick Whitman effectively does is he swaps the dog tags. He swaps the identity. So he basically gives that burnt corpse the Dick Whitman dog tags, and he takes the Don Draper ones, and he assumes the identity of Don Draper. And he lives that identity for the remainder of his life. So effectively, he reinvents himself. And this idea of reinvention, self-reinvention, is an important aspect of what Draper is all about, but I think it's also an important metaphor for how advertising works, the way that advertising can reinvent meanings for products and commodities and basic goods and the rest. So Draper is a troubled figure, right? In some respects, he's a flawed figure, in part because of his past and the way that he's trying to project a new identity throughout his life. He's not the most likable of characters. He's a womanizer. He's a liar. He is somewhat sympathetic, though. As a viewer, most people would have some sympathy for Draper, and they would probably actually, support him in terms of identifying him as a protagonist. He is emotionally stunted. He's invulnerable. And yet he's got this incredible attribute. He is able to plumb human needs and desires, right? So here's somebody who doesn't really emotionally connect with the people around him very well, but he is able to somehow plumb the needs and desires, the emotional wants of people, and to do that almost with an artist's intuition, and to do that in the realm of advertising. So you could say he's a kind of a Mozart of advertising, and certainly an exceptional talent and skill with respect to that. And the way to get an encapsulation of that, a very short kind of rendition of that, is to watch this clip I have here. And it's essentially, it's a pitch, right? This is I think it's in the second season of Mad Men. It's basically the agency, Sterling Draper, is trying to pitch they're trying to get the business of the client that's there. And the client is Kodak. And Draper has come up with an idea as to how to reinvent the kind of name and the meaning for this new product that Kodak is coming out, which is essentially a slide wheel for showing photographs in slide form. And when you watch that clip, notice how he embodies what we've talked about in this course in terms of the therapeutics of advertising. As he says, it's about promoting the new, right? This new invention of what the Kodak people called the wheel. But then he talks about nostalgia. And he talks about the way that you have to infuse a product, in this case, with a form of nostalgia, right? It's not just about going forward with the new. It's about moving people back in the past. And Draper understands that that's how photography works, right? That's what people do with photos. They're not just to sort of document where they are at a particular moment. They're to be retained. They're to be kept in people's lives, in photo books and the rest like that. And they're to become an important part of who they are in terms of the way they look back on themselves. All right, so watch that clip. So do that right now and pause, hint, hint. Now, and come back. So maybe you're back now after seeing that. And just think about that line that you just saw, right? Where Draper's saying that it's not, it's not a wheel, right? It's a time machine. It goes backwards, forwards. It takes us to a place where we ache to go again. It's not called the wheel. It's called the carousel. And it lets us travel the way a child travels, around and back again, to a place where we know we are loved. So here's this idea of taking a very kind of nondescript product, right? It's just a mechanical device for showing photographs on a slide projector. And he infuses that with a sense of love and belonging and the happiness of a child. In this case, he's actually showing his marriage and his wife. Now, keep in mind, he's also a womanizer, right? He cheats on his wife. He's not the best of father to his kids either, right? And yet he's able to sort of project all these incredible meanings onto this very generic type of product. And he does that so effectively. So anyway, that's my take on Mad Men and Don Draper, particularly so. The show, the episode that you're going to look at today is called The Hobo Code. It's from the first season. And again, you can look at that. I think now it's on, it used to be on Netflix, and then that stopped a couple months ago, actually. And then now I believe it's on Amazon Prime, or you can just pay $2 and you can actually buy the episode. It's a great episode. When you're watching this episode, think about some of the themes we've talked about in this course, right? The legitimacy of advertising, the kind of crisis of legitimacy involving advertising. It's referenced in this episode. Think about the idea, the tension between what is authentic and what is artificial, what is true and what is false. I mean, that's the tension that advertising navigates, right? It inhabits that kind of tension. Think about the idea that of identity and self-invention, and especially when you're seeing those scenes, those flashback scenes with the hobo and back into the 1930s. Think about the way the hobo talks about himself in terms of reinventing himself and the kind of freedom that he has in that respect. And then think about the theme that we've also talked about in terms of the therapeutic function of advertising, and this idea about advertising as an apostle of modernity, but also something that serves as a kind of salve or a way to assuage the anxieties that people have about embracing the new. Those themes are in the show, right? And I want you to talk about some of that in the tutorial on Tuesday. Okay. All right. Now we're going to turn to the question of subliminal advertising, which is an odd thing in some respects, right? Because we're actually going to be talking about something that, for the most part, really didn't exist in terms of practice, in terms of the way that the advertising institution functioned or anything like that. There was actually hardly any instances, very, very few instances of subliminal advertising actually occurring. And yet, what's fascinating about this topic is that so many people believed it was happening. And that's why we want to look at this, right? So just to give you some perspective on that, the extent of that belief, a couple opinion surveys, one from 1983, 81% of people claimed knowledge of subliminal advertising. The same percentage, 81%, thought it was used by advertisers, and 44% thought it was an effective form of advertising, right? That it would actually, work effectively to sell goods. So first of all, what do we mean by subliminal advertising? Well, this is the idea that you can have an ad, whether it's a television ad or a print ad, and you can embed some kind of image in that ad that you don't necessarily register on a conscious level. You register it only on a subconscious level or a subliminal level. But in fact, even though you may not be consciously aware of something you see in the ad, and in fact, it is unconsciously registered, and subsequently, it means that the belief is that it would then produce a kind of desired behavior, i.e. a liking for the product or a willingness to buy that product. So that's the basic premise of subliminal advertising. But as I said, it mostly did not happen. But most people believed it did happen. So it's a good example of what might be called a vernacular critique or a kind of folklore critique of media, in this case advertising. So by vernacular, I mean coming from below, from the people, as opposed to from above, like with experts or that sort of thing. It's an interesting example as well of a form of misinformation, right? Now, we'll come back to that later in the context of COVID and the recent U.S. election, or the ongoing election, because Trump won't step down, it seems, or whatever. But the idea of misinformation and disinformation, right? In many respects, the belief in subliminal advertising was a form of misinformation. People were misunderstood that, in fact, it was happening, and they continued to believe it was, and they grew concerned about it, right? So we're going to touch on that as well later. Now, the whole idea of talking about this is, it's not like I could basically come to you and talk for 10 minutes and say, look, subliminal advertising, don't believe it, it never happened, so we're only going to have a 10-minute lecture, okay? Or that would be a 20-second lecture, I guess. But in fact, we want to actually explore this, right? Because it's fascinating when something, that when people believe something is really happening, and when it's actually not empirically supported to be happening, we want to understand why, right? We want to understand how it can be so compelling in people's minds this can be going on. So to do that, we have to actually look at the history of subliminal advertising and take it up to, well, we'll actually get up to about the last 10 years or so, okay? So here's where our story starts, and it's an odd place to start. It's in a cinema, a movie theater in Fort Lee, New Jersey in 1956. And a researcher, who we'll talk about in a second, set up what he said was a kind of research study. And he basically he arranged with this movie cinema. This is what he claims. Again, we'll talk about whether this study actually happened or not. But he effectively claimed that what happened was there was different audiences seeing the same movie. And some of the audience, all they saw was the regular movie. But the other audiences saw a version of the movie that had these subliminal edits put into the movie. Flashes of Coca-Cola or popcorn that were injected into the movie in 1/300th of a second or something. So you wouldn't be able to consciously see it. And the claim was that people unconsciously saw those images of Coke and popcorn. And the result of that, the behavioral outcome of that, was that those people bought more Coke, 18% more. And the ones watching the film like that bought more popcorn, 58% more. Okay? Now, as we'll get to in a second, the study wasn't actually revealed at the time. It actually was revealed about a year later. And just to let you know, there's actually no verified documentation that this study actually did occur the way I described, and whether or not the results correspond to what I just said, right? There's some real doubt about any of this being true or not, but it doesn't matter, as you'll see, because people would come to believe it was true. All right, this is the fellow who did the study. His name's James Vicary, and he was what would be called a kind of creative market researcher at this time. So by creative, as you'll see, he wasn't really doing conventional market research. He was doing different things in terms of looking at word association and sort of in-depth kind of psychological processes involved in market research. So he went to the University of Michigan as a business student. By 1945, he's founded his own market research agency. He's, was reasonably successful. It had about a dozen or so employees, many hundreds of field researchers across the country, and some prominent clients like AT&T and BF Goodrich. The work they did, a lot of it tended to do things like looking at word connotations and word associations. So what words work best for naming a brand or a company, and he would do some in-depth research along those lines. He was somebody who published academically as well. He published in some fairly high-ranking journals like the Harvard Business Review and the Journal of Marketing. He worked with established social scientists who were also market researchers, people like Paul Lazarsfeld. And he did what would be today called a kind of research called administrative research. And that means that the kind of research he was doing and was designed to sort of help people become better marketers or better advertisers, to help them, administratively get a better handle on that kind of work, right? So when we look at advertising, it's not so much from that perspective. It's more of a kind of critical research perspective, right? We want to look at the way advertising impacts society and culture, the kind of political economy of advertising. We want to understand the historical aspects of it. There are a bunch of questions that we would ask that would not be centered around how do we understand advertising from the standpoint of making you potentially a better marketer or advertiser, all right? So that's the administrative research standpoint. So one example of that was Vicary did this research for a client, a supermarket, grocery store, and they basically put hidden cameras in the grocery store, and these cameras were trained to sort of look at the eye movements of women as they came into the stores in different parts of the store, looking at even like the blink pattern and the way that the eyes moved. And out of that, they were trying to determine what women found enticing about certain aspects of the grocery store and that sort of thing. And then out of that, they would do subsequent kind of in-depth research and interviewing with women like that to get a sense of how they understood their experiences in grocery stores. So Vicary's research was influenced and was really kind of an adjunct of motivational research. And motivational research became a very important genre of market research in the 1950s and well into the 60s. And in fact, in Mad Men, I forget what season it starts, but you actually do get these motivational researchers come into the agency and talk about the way that advertising should be transformed in that context. It's quite fascinating for me to watch anyway, to see it in Mad Men. This is a type of research that draws to a certain degree on psychological theory and practice, but it's more drawing on a psychoanalytical approach. And that was the belief in psychoanalysis that there were these unconscious drivers and motivators that basically were powerful motivators for how people behaved and how they think. But they were unconscious, right? They were sort of subconscious. And these unconscious motivators were also important factors in terms of consumption and consumer behavior and that sort of thing. These ideas, the psychoanalytical ideas, derive very much from the influence of Sigmund Freud, a very important psychological sort of theorist and somebody who pioneered psychoanalytical thought and study. And essentially, psychoanalytical thinking, I can't give you a long description of it, but essentially, for people doing psychoanalytical therapy, for example, right? It's like somebody you're seeing a therapist or something. At that time, the thinking would have been if you were having problems in your life, problems with your personality, problems with your psychological well-being, the psychoanalytical approach was to try and to probe those underlying subconscious almost factors in your life that seem to be kind of getting in the way of you having a happy life. And so they would spend time looking at aspects of your childhood to see if there was trauma that you experienced as a child that you may have repressed, and that the repression is actually part of the problem in terms of you living a full and happy life. So that's, in a nutshell, what an aspect of psychoanalytical theory would be. Now, the way that these researchers approached it was that people didn't consciously know why they did things. They basically were responding to these subconscious drivers. And the approach for getting at that subconscious those subconscious factors or feelings or motivators was derived from a research methodology called depth interviewing. So you're not doing a basic kind of surface level survey here, right? You're not just asking a bunch of questions about do you like red cars or blue cars, or do you like to shop in the morning or night. These researchers thought to really understand why people consume the way they do, you had to get below the hood, so to speak, right, under the hood. And the process they used was called depth interviewing. So these would be kind of far-ranging, open-ended questions you would ask people, trying to probe what were the underlying kind of features of their lives. Sometimes people didn't even consciously think about them very much, but you could kind of probe those things through a certain type of, in this case, called depth interviewing. So for example, you would say if there's a woman, one of the studies found that women were, when they were getting into the late 40s and 50s, were buying more clothes and more jewelry and more perfume. And so the question was, why were they doing that? And through this kind of depth interviewing, they found that the women, this is, again, I'm not saying this was the case, but this is what the research suggested was the case, that women at that age were sort of moving past their fertility years. They were approaching menopausal years. They were struck by a sense of loss of youth and beauty, fear of losing maybe a husband or love or something. Those were the motivating factors in terms of driving them to buy the clothes or the perfume and those sorts of things, right? If you ask those women why they were buying it, they probably wouldn't give you those answers because they probably hadn't really thought in detail about what those driving underlying motives were, right? The researcher who became the most prominent promoter of motivational research was someone called Ernest Dichter. Dichter was an Austrian who became a refugee from Nazi Germany, comes to New York in the late 1930s. He's a social scientist, begins doing this type of research in the 1940s. He establishes in 1946 the Institute for Motivational Research. And this basically just did what I just described, using Freud's psychoanalytic techniques to do research. And this Dichter became quite influential and quite popular amongst businesses too, right? Lots and lots of different types of businesses started to use his research method, and hired Dichter himself for doing this. Okay, so that's the context, right, of what you have in the late 50s, right? So you've got motivational research coming along, right? The influence of Freud, psychoanalytic thinking, the subconscious as being an important driver in terms of people's behavior. And Vicary seems to want to kind of latch on to that, but he does it in his particular way. So in 1957, he establishes the Subliminal Projection Company. He gets a patent for what is believed to be kind of the way of technologically kind of embedding these subliminal edits into a TV show or into an ad or something like that. And he then holds a press conference in 1957. This is about a year after he had done that Fort Lee study. He holds this press conference and he announces to the world, and quite successfully because it gets a lot of press coverage, he announces to the world that Fort Lee, New Jersey study in the cinema, and basically says, this is what we've done. Behold, there's this great new technological innovation in the world of advertising. And people should be happy about that. And the reason why is because he said that, if we could subliminally insert messaging into movies or into other types of, television shows or something like that, wouldn't that be great if the ads could work that way? They wouldn't. They were sort of what he called sort of gentle taps or reminders in the unconscious level that would sort of remind people at some point later when they're in the grocery store, maybe to pick up Coke instead of Pepsi or something like that. Wouldn't that be great? Because then we could eliminate those commercials. There'd be more time on television or even at the cinema for actual program content and not ad time and stuff. So he framed it that way. He said that it was by and large a kind of innocent sort of project. He even referred to it as a kind of bandwidth of the brain, the subconscious level that people may not be aware of, but you can just sort of tap into that, a kind of innocent band of human perception, as he called it, almost like FM signals versus AM signals or something, radio. And for the most part, he said this was a beneficial undertaking. It was benign in terms of, having ethical problems. There were no ethical problems, he said. And he said it was looking good for him. He announced that he had 250 advertisers that were willing to start working with him on this new form of advertising. So that's what he basically projected out. Now, soon after, other companies start to jump into this. Here's one example, the Precon Processing Company. And they were established soon after 1957. These were some psychologists, people with psychological training, and some physicists. And they took a patent out for what they said was this new psychorama method. And what they basically said they were doing was they were taking the genre of horror films and they were making them even scarier by embedding subliminal edits or shots of things into these movies, right? So these would be things like skulls or blood or kill scenes or whatever the case may be. So you would inject that subliminally into the film, and it would heighten the experience of horror, the experience of fear, and it would make for a more kind of dramatic kind of experience of movie going, right? It sort of elevates your level of engagement with the movie without you even realizing it, because of the fear factor being raised so high. So they did this with a couple movies. I've listed them here: My World Dies Screaming, Date with Death at this time. Again, this turned out to be, the claims here were really not documented as to what extent the actual subliminal edits were done the way they said. But it ended up being more of a gimmick, right? In the sense that it didn't really sort of change the way this genre of movie making, the horror film genre, it didn't affect it really in any significant way. And it was just a kind of gimmick that seemed to sort of die out pretty soon after. Now, how did people respond to these claims of Vicary and others, right? These subliminal advertising claims. Well, immediately professional psychologists, so psychology profs and the rest, universities, they kind of dumped scorn on this idea. They basically said they were very skeptical that this could work, right? That you could basically embed a kind of subliminal ad message in some kind of program content and think that, down the road somebody is going to buy Coke over Pepsi because of that. And they said that because they had done their own kind of controlled studies in their labs in the 50s, for example. And they basically said these were studies which would be called kind of priming studies, right? Where you kind of prime people to have a particular response by introducing a certain kind of variable, right? So, for example, they might show people a bunch of faces that are all neutral. They're not happy, they're not sad. But before, and so the question you ask them, well, tell me you think this person's more happy or sad, right? And what they found is that if you did a kind of subliminal cut of some really happy faces in there that people might not actually consciously see, they found that the effect of that was that people would judge the faces they did see, which were neutral. They would be more likely to judge them as being leaning to happy as opposed to the sad, right? But they also said that the effect of that was limited. It wasn't really a huge increase in terms of those choosing happy over sad. And they also said it was of short duration. That people, it's not like, if you brought them back the next day, they didn't somehow still have that subliminal memory happening, right? So it wouldn't necessarily work with advertising, right, in that sense. So that's the kind of scorn and skepticism that psychologists heaped on this enterprise. Now, the advertising industry came out and said this is garbage. They said that there's no evidence. We don't do this. We don't. Why would you run an ad that had your message subliminally registered, right? It's hard enough to get people to notice ads because there's so many of them when you sort of pound people over the head with the message. And why would we want to be doing something like that subliminally? It makes no sense. And so they basically said it was ineffective. It was a kind of ridiculous notion. And they realized, too, that it would harm the legitimacy of advertising, right? Imagine advertising, all we've talked about in terms of the legitimacy problems of advertising, and imagine it now being associated with something that was tapping into the subconscious. So the advertisers knew right away that they were going to deny this, and well, not really deny, they were going to say it just wasn't happening, which was mostly true, okay? They actually are telling the truth in this respect. Here's an example. The image here is from one of the industry organizations for advertising, one of the professional associations for advertising. And they're basically just saying that there's nothing to these claims of subliminal imagery being embedded into print ads or into video ads or whatever. And the other person who dumped on this notion of subliminal advertising being effective or being practical was Ernst Dichter, right? This is the guy who was doing the motivational research. And he basically said it was some kind of cheap gimmick. And he also he realized that this would be a potential threat to the kind of psychoanalytical methods that he was using in his motivational research and the depth interviewing. He understood that if people came to have real concerns about something like subliminal advertising, he might get lumped into that, even though his psychoanalytical approach for research had nothing at all to do with subliminal messaging and the rest. All right. So, some of the other responses, network radio and television, even independent broadcasters. The networks right off the bats forbade or banned their affiliate stations, broadcasters and their networks, banned them from even considering doing something like this, like whether taking ads that had subliminal messaging or embedding subliminal messages into program content. So they basically up front said, no, this is something we would never ever consider. Now, cinema owners were initially kind of reluctant to give their answer to this, right? And that's in part because television was in a much better position in the late 1950s than cinema was, right? If you recall that television starts to appear in the late 40s, early 50s in the United States and Canada, and it increases exponentially in terms of use. So by 1960, 9 in 10 homes have a TV set. People watching television oftentimes are people who 5 or 10 years earlier would have spent that time at the cinema. So cinema attendance and revenues are dropping while those of television and even still radio are actually increasing. So cinema owners were more financially kind of vulnerable. And so they were more inclined to think about maybe there's some possibilities here, like for us, right? If we did have subliminal messages embedded into movies that we were showing and we were paid extra for that, maybe that could help our bottom line. Again, very little evidence besides the ones I talked about before, those horror movies, very little evidence of there being films and cinemas that were doing this, though. And then the last point, there were a few instances of public service announcements that thought they could use subliminal messages to sort of enhance the message. So there was one, for example, that there was a fire safety message, and they flashed subliminal messages in the ad, now claiming that would actually improve people's uptake of that message, which seems odd, right? Because you think that the message itself about fire safety that you overtly present should be enough, right? But anyway, but the other example that I think is really interesting, and this had to do with the Kansas police trying to catch the BTK serial killer in the 60s and 70s. Now, this, for those of you who have seen the show Mindhunters on Netflix, you will know something about this example of this serial killer. This was a serial killer that killed, I think more than 10 people over the course of like 15 or 20 years. And the FBI agents in the Mindhunters show are, trying to figure out how to catch this guy. Well, at one point, the Wichita police chief has a kind of releases a kind of video of him addressing people, trying to raise awareness of this case. And they apparently did a subliminal edit into that press conference with the message, "Call the police chief." And the thinking was, and they got that into television news reports that were out. And the thinking was, it's kind of a foolish thinking, right? Like that the serial killer, somebody had been terrorizing people's lives for more than, I think, a decade by this point, that somehow he would be subliminally influenced by this message to turn himself in. It's a ridiculous notion, but it was tried at the time, as were like psychics were used for this case because the police were desperate and probably didn't think about the social science of what they were doing. But and that's also touched upon in the Mindhunters series. Great series. You really want to see something good, you should look at that. Incidentally, the young FBI agent Holden Ford is played by the actor Jonathan Groff, who was the original King George III in the original Hamilton production on Broadway, and I quite love his performances in that. So now for that. Okay, so the other aspect of the context for the late 1950s in terms of why people would be so likely to believe that subliminal advertising was developing and it was going to be a real problem in society was the release of this book by Vance Packard called The Hidden Persuaders. And this book proved phenomenally successful. It was a bestseller for months and months and months. And it was an attack, for the most part, on motivational research and depth research, the things I've just been talking about before. Not on subliminal advertising. Because note the year. The book comes out the same year that Vicary is actually initially talking about subliminal advertising. So when the book comes out, it doesn't even know that subliminal advertising is on the horizon. So it's an attack on motivational research. And Packard basically says the kind of things that Dichter is doing will lead to sort of loss of individual will. It will involve these sort of powerful market researchers controlling the mass population from a distance through the types of in-depth research that they're doing. He even equated some of the power that these market researchers, these motivational researchers had with a kind of hypnotism from a distance. They would sort of put people almost in a kind of trance-like state through the power of the social science kind of research that they were undertaking. So it's an attack on that kind of research. It's an attack on the consumer society that it's producing, and it's an attack on the power of advertising as a whole. Okay, the word subliminal does not appear once in this book, and yet in years as you get into the late 50s and early 60s, people come to associate this Vance Packard book, The Hidden Persuaders, with an attack on subliminal advertising as well. They actually just lump it in there in terms of their popular recollection of what the book was about, even though the book never ever discusses subliminal advertising. So in the 50s and late 60s, you've got massive press coverage of this phenomenon, right? I mean, newspapers and magazines are running stories about this. They're saying this is outrageous. We shouldn't be having subliminal messaging or advertising. And yet, as I said, one example, and the kind of critique that they offered, right? It's almost over the top kind of belief that this is the worst thing that ever came. One writer in the magazine called The Nation called subliminal advertising the most alarming and outrageous discovery since Mr. Gatling invented his gun, which would be the Gatling gun. They worried that it would turn us into robots and effectively undermine our sense of individual will and control. Now, again, why would people be overreacting so much, right? I mean, it's not happening, and yet people believe it's happening. And, here's some more factors, right, in terms of why people would believe this is happening if you look at the late 50s and early 60s context, right? So there was a belief in kind of mind control, right? This idea that you could control people, you could tap into their unconscious, you could somehow control their minds from a distance. People believe this in different ways. One factor, as we said, was the power of Freud's thinking and the idea of the id, the ego, the superego, the psychoanalytic ideas that I've talked about before. The other factor, during the Korean War in the early 1950s, Americans went over there, fought. Some were captured by the North Koreans and the Chinese, and they became prisoners of war, POWs. And what seemed to happen to them from the perspective of a lot of Americans that they were brainwashed. And it's because they were later found to be giving public messages in support of communist China, in support of the North Koreans, attacking the United States. And there was a sense that, and some of them were even doing this after they came back to the United States after the war. And there was a sense that they had been brainwashed by the communist authorities in China and North Korea, that somehow the brain was this thing that, you could effectively wipe it out or give a kind of clean slate with these new ideas that were harmful and inimical, seemingly, to the United States. Now, these men that I was talking about, these soldiers who were captured, these POWs, they were tortured, right? I mean, that's the real story, right? They were effectively if you torture people long enough, they'll say anything, right? They'll come to believe lots of things, and they'll be traumatized for the rest of their lives. The other factor is the Cold War period, right? And this is the sort of the bipolarization of much of the world between the liberal democratic West, countries like Canada, the United States, versus the communist bloc countries, the Soviet Union, China, and the belief that those countries, those communist countries, were totalitarian societies where individuals had no liberal or individual rights. Effectively, the state controlled everything, and the state worked to manipulate the masses through propaganda and mass information campaigns and the rest. The other thing that happened in the late 50s was Aldous Huxley, who wrote a very influential novel in the early 30s called Brave New World. He reintroduces, he kind of updates it with this new essay called Brave New World Revisited in 1958. And it reintroduces some of the themes that he talked about in that earlier novel, themes about totalitarian control in society and the rest. George Orwell's 1984 is released in the late 1940s. It also sells extraordinarily well throughout the 1950s. And as many of you know, the central premise of 1984 is the power of Big Brother, the power of the state, the power of the state in creating a totalitarian society where effectively the state even comes to know how you think, and that. So it's a dystopian future, a vision of the future. And one thing I just want to, so that's the context of the 1950s and 60s. Now, I want you just to jump ahead a little bit. I've got a film clip here from this movie called Agency. And essentially the movie uses subliminal advertising as a plot driver. So the plot of the movie is that there's this ad agency that's owned by this sort of sketchy guy who's working in cahoots with this mean kind of politician, this sort of evil type politician. And the ad agency is going to embed subliminal messages into political advertising that's going to get this guy elected, right? That's the premise of the movie. Now, what's interesting is that if you watch the clip that I have here, it's about 2 minutes. You start about 22 minutes, 40 seconds in. This is a clip of the protagonist in the movie, who's not that advertiser I just mentioned. He's basically, in a kind of matter-of-fact way, explaining to his girlfriend what the agency does in terms of subliminal messaging, right? And subliminal advertising. So he talks about how we put these sexualized images in photographs of ice cubes that appear in liquor ads and that sort of thing. And anyway, look at the clip. The reason I have that there is because not because he's not describing something that ad agencies did in reality, right? It's a movie, right? It's not real. Ad agencies were not doing that, but the fact that you could have a movie where the entire sort of plot narrative is centered on subliminal messaging being done on a grand scale to undermine democracy, and it portrays this ad agency in a matter-of-fact way doing subliminal messaging in a routine way, that can influence people, right, who watch them. Somebody watching that movie might sort of come to think that this is something that, you know, ad agencies would do. So why not, right? So again, that's some more of the context, okay? So we'll take a break now and come back. We'll come back and we'll do the rest of the lecture. Okay, cheers.